Welcome to another Dynasty Underdog production, the Dynasty Underdog Personal Rankings Symposium. Jake and I are here again talking about our rankings a little bit in the ranking process, and today we're going to get into the process of tiering. We think it's super important to not only rank players in the traditional way, but we also believe that tiering each player is super important to get a little bit more depth of valuation for each player and understand that while ranking is a linear process, that's not how it works in your head, or that's not how evaluations work and values work in trades. Tiering them out feels like a much more holistic way to get the point across of where we view them in relation to rankings. Okay, so I'm going to pull up our Dynasty Underdog positional tiers here so I can show you a little bit of how I think we want to approach the tiering system. And I kind of like how we have our tiers set here, and they kind of fall into alphabetical order, which is great for me because I do want to get away from the idea at some level. I want the user to be able to get away from that linear thought process, or that it matters which order they are ranked in within the tier, because the true idea of tiers is getting away from one of them being ranked above the other, right? It's to not have to go through that decision-making process in such a linear fashion. Looking at our tiers here, just the quarterback bucket here, just looking at Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, I think there's a clear cutoff point there between that tier and the next group of players, right? And I'd be happy to have any of those guys if I'm in the top 4 picks. And I think that's kind of how you need to approach looking at this specific tab. It's not Jalen Hurts over Josh Allen. That's not what we're saying here. that's not the importance of tiers. And that's not how I think anybody should be looking at tiers, even if we are going over to, our actual rankings and you have your tiers here. I think it's super beneficial because, first of all, you can decipher, if there's tier 2 guys a little bit, higher than you'd want to take them in comparison to like another position's tier 1. It's very beneficial to see that, where it's like, do you want tier 1 wide receiver over tier 2 quarterback, those kind of things. But it's also just helpful in seeing them in the actual order they're in, how we have them here, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, but they're all tier 1. So if you want to go by that strict order, you have that available for you, but this allows you to get a little bit more depth out of the rankings. One thing I wanted to get into with Jake a little bit is an example of kind of how the tiers interact. One thing we were looking at, kind of how to come to terms with players who are in the same range, but potentially in different tiers, right next to each other, but in different tiers and even at the same position. One of these that we thought was a really good example was Drake London versus Brandon Ayuk. Okay. Drake London here, 22-year-old receiver, guy who everybody, I think, believes could be a stud in the right situation, been held back by the Dark Lord, Arthur Smith himself. No quarterback to speak of, just a lot going on there context-wise to lead you to believe that things could get right for this 22-year-old. But he hasn't produced. He simply hasn't produced. So that's why he remains in a tier 3, whereas a Brandon Ayuk or a T. Higgins sits in that tier 2 range. These guys have been ultra productive at times, 25 years old, still pretty young. So they kind of fall ahead of him in that tiering system. Thinking about our last episode, talking about adjusting, things can get right quickly. The Falcons just hired Raheem Morris. Things change a little bit more towards a Rams style kind of offense. Things could get right really quickly, and then maybe that tier changes. As things currently stand, that's kind of how we're trying to use the tiers and try to understand when players are ranked near each other but maybe tiered differently. Those are the kind of decision trees we're looking at to kind of make those tiering choices.
I think it's also really important that with our own exercise, there's this truly pulling and pushing process as well, right? Like, we have Billy's perspective versus my perspective. And this is a perfect example where I have Brandon Ayuk actually ranked higher with a higher tier than Billy does. And Drake London is in a higher tier and ranked higher than Brandon Ayuk. So we're at this place where they're almost evening out, where I think that actually provides you, the individual who's consuming this, a much better interpretation of kind of a middle ground between our two thought processes. Because in the grand scheme of things, the last thing you want when you're consuming our work, as well as when you're going to produce your own, is finding yourself pulling into that market value. What we're trying to provide is kind of that symbiotic approach of how do we create a visualization of what Dynasty Underdog is perceiving their value to be. And as we continue to bring in more of our personalities into this worksheet and into our process, we'll be able to then define even better across more individual minds. And I think that's one of the best collective processes that you can do. So the last thing I did want to just kind of highlight on is this is also really important for understanding the rebuilder versus contender as well, right? So in this circumstance, we're not telling you in the sheet that you should select Drake London over Tyreek Hill. What we're telling you is that we value Drake London's rebuilder value higher than Tyreek Hill moving forward. By all means, in a lot of builds, even in a rebuilder startup, I might still take Tyreek Hill because I think that his immediate value might be more and I can get potentially a higher draft pick for him in the upcoming rookie draft, something along those lines. It's important to be able to understand those tiny nuances when you're kind of working through your own process, because each time you look at this sheet, whether it's your own sheet or our sheet, it's going to change. Billy and I, as we're talking through this process, we want to make changes because that's just kind of the inherent nature of it. And it's why we talk so much about adjusting, because the adjusting process should never stop. Every time you kind of think about stopping your adjusting process is when you kind of lose that small little gap between you and the rest of the market.
If you listeners haven't been able to determine this for yourself, Jake is obviously the brains of this operation. Absolutely elite stuff there. Really, really top-notch stuff there, Jake. I think that was a great explanation of kind of what we're trying to get across and how we're going about it, how we want the viewers, listeners to go about it, and what we want them to take from this, right? It is an educational mission, right? We're trying to help the community better understand how to use rankings and better understand how to create them, take advantage of them, and all that good stuff, and how to get into tiering, right? Which is something that I don't think enough people think about, and kind of think about how they interact with the rankings. And like what Jake is saying is like so poignant for what we're doing here. And the last thing I want to say is that I think I kind of want to echo what Jake was saying a little bit, in that we challenge each other a lot on these values, right? And we're not trying to say like, come to my side of the line here, come to my side of the road, or trying to convince each other necessarily. But we're definitely looking at each other being like, why is it like that? Like, why are we doing it this way? Is there a way to push this guy up or down because of this reason here? I had this thought process. Did you consider these factors, right? And then allow you to have as much information as possible. And something that I want to hit on, something I've been thinking about a lot, is something that Jake also mentioned in the first episode a little bit in a different way, is that, are we trying to help you win your leagues? Yes, obviously, like the end goal, we want you to win. But I think the goal of our podcast, of these episodes, of anything we're really doing, is trying to get you the best information possible to be able to do that yourself, right? Because like, I can't win your league for you. You're not going to listen to every single take I have. I'm not going to be able to convince you of everything. And we're not trying to do that. I think we're trying to be as unbiased as possible, grounded in our beliefs as possible, and deliver to you the best information that we can from the best sources. Sometimes that's us, sometimes that's other people, but this is one of those things that we're trying to do. We're trying to deliver the best information possible with our rankings and with this ranking series. And that's all I got for this edition of the Dynasty Underdog Personal Ranking Symposium. This is our process for tiering. First edition was our overall process kind of why we rank and how to go about it and when to adjust. We're going to have a couple more videos coming out. What we're going to get into next is positional values, kind of how we decide what we look for in each position when it comes to ranking and tiering. We'll get more into depth kind of, with just each one of those, what are the individual factors that we're looking at. After that, we're going to get into combining the rankings and tiers, talking a little bit more about market values and how to maneuver those with the rankings, how to adjust. And lastly, I think what we're going to get into, which is super fun, is adding future picks in there, which if you've seen the rankings on the screen, you know that they are in there, and that's a really fun feature, and talking about kind of why those should be in there and how you value them amongst the pool of players. Anything else from you, Jake, before we get out of here?
No, looking forward to seeing all of you in episode 3.
Awesome. All right, everybody, take care. Join us on our main show of Dynasty Underdog. Comes out every Wednesday. And we'll catch you next time on the next edition of the Dynasty Underdog Personal Ranking Symposium. Peace out.